The views expressed by our guests are their own and do not reflect the official stance of their employer or any affiliated organizations.
Welcome back to the Council House Podcast. I'm your co-host, Ken Koch, and today I'm here again with Stephen Cobb from Foley Lardner. And Stephen is the vice chair of the state AG practice at Foley Lardner here in D.C. Welcome, Stephen.
Ken, it's great to be back on the pod. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, so last time we got together, it was pre-election, and we talked about playing two hands of cards. This is how you framed it: two hands of cards, and what happens in a Harris win, what happens in a Trump win. It was a really great session. We know the results, and we're 6 months into a Trump administration. So I really just wanted to do an update with you and kind of see where we are. We know the history, and you were a great prognosticator on what was going to happen if a Trump administration happened. So we'd like to just check in and see what the current status is, and then we're going to ask you to pull out your crystal ball for the future. From what you thought was going to happen in the Trump administration pre-election, is there anything that didn't happen the way you thought it was going to happen? Kind of like what are those? Are there any differences? And then kind of what's the current landscape?
Well, we're only playing one hand now, sticking with this poker analogy, but there's a lot more wild cards than I think anyone could have anticipated.
Yeah.
So one of the things we talked about in our first podcast was the likelihood for kind of a step back in regulatory oversight in a potential Trump administration, and the ability for state AGs to start and fill that void. I think that is true. This is what is starting to happen, but I think it's happening at a level and in a manner that we didn't necessarily expect. And so when you look at CFPB, for instance, they're not just taking a step back. In many ways, the administration is looking to totally dismantle or at least reimagine what that regulatory oversight agency's mission is and how they go about doing it. And so what you've seen is, in more than one instance, is that CFPB has stopped bringing enforcement actions and state AGs have stepped into the void to carry them on themselves, or filed new actions in the absence of that regulatory enforcement coming from the feds. And you've seen that some with FTC too. And part of this is, kind of what we're still seeing play out in real time, which is the administration's ability or lack thereof, as we go through the litigation process, to fire heads of independent agencies. And so that's a constitutional question that's making its way through the courts, also involving state AGs. Really what the mission, and the ability of these agencies to continue to operate and focus on their regulatory oversight for those first 90 days in particular was largely up in the air. As you're seeing lots of firing, you're seeing DOJ going through many of these agencies, taking out career employees, going through the RIF cycle, and we're still kind of figuring out what the waves of that are going to look like and how that's going to affect, one, the mission, but two, even the ability and bandwidth of many of these federal agencies to move forward as they have in the past.
Yeah, so we've seen kind of the gutting of the federal agencies. I agree with that. Enforcement has dipped. Things like UDAP, CFPB is pretty much gone. FCPA is only going to be enforced for very specific cartel type activity, and I think human trafficking or something like that. And SEC enforcement is pretty much not flatline, but it's
it still has a heartbeat.
There are different priorities and priority focuses for the federal administration now, and so we've seen a reduction quite a bit. So tell me what is going on with the states, and are states picking up the baton? Have they? I've seen some headlines in the paper about comments made by some of the state AGs, I think in New York, maybe Ms. James, State AG James. And but give me your perspective on what you've seen, because you're obviously super close to that landscape, and just kind of tell me what you're seeing from the states so far.
Sure. And one of the things that we talked about in the first podcast is, regardless of who won, you were going to see a foil from state attorneys general as being kind of the balancing force to an administration. If that had been a Harris administration, you might have seen a lot of Republican attorneys general mobilize and provide that balance. And certainly we've seen that with predominantly Democratic AGs and what that has looked like vis-a-vis the Trump administration. So many of these actions, whether that's the reduction in force or whether it is the firing of heads of independent agencies, you've seen Democratic AGs work together and file lawsuits, whether it is on federal funding issues, whether it is on the firing of federal employees, whether it's on the firing of appointed heads of agencies. They are working diligently on those issues. I don't think anyone anticipated the breadth of those issues coming in. I think we all knew that there would be a different mission, but I think it was somewhat of a surprise, really considering how far the administration has gone in the first 90 days in those areas. So on the one hand, there's that immediacy where AGs have stepped into the void, providing kind of a counterweight. But two, there's also picking up what are existing cases that had been or will be dropped by federal regulators, and then flexing their regulatory muscles to let them know that this isn't not just because the feds have stepped out doesn't mean that there is not going to be a regulatory regime following up on these things. And so I think by way of both rhetoric and mission and the cases they've filed, many state attorneys general are really making sure that the private sector is aware that when it comes to consumer protection, when it comes to UDAP, which is unfair and deceptive trade practices for those listening, when it comes to antitrust issues and competition, that they are in the process of hiring up and stepping into the void even more so than they have in the past.
What are some of the states that are sort of leading the charge in this?
A lot of it, not surprisingly, comes with states that have the most bandwidth and really the most lawyers in the space, as well as the subject matter expertise in these areas. So you're looking at New York, California, Illinois, New Jersey, Massachusetts. On antitrust, Colorado has developed quite an expertise in that space.
Yeah, because they were the ones that did were able to kind of kill the Kroger deal, right?
Well, General Weiser has just an incredibly deep background in antitrust and competition work, and that priority is something that has gotten mirrored in his 2 terms as Attorney General of Colorado. You know, he's a former dean of a law school and then was Deputy Assistant Attorney General of the United States for antitrust before becoming Attorney General. And so it's not surprising that expertise has bled through into that office as well for hirings as well as leadership.
So just looking through headlines and trying to look at the number of cases that have started up against public companies, not necessarily against the federal government, but cases that have started up against, public companies. Oregon has a lawsuit against Coinbase alleging unlawful sale of unregistered securities through its crypto trading platform, violating Oregon securities laws. So that's one example of sort of in the security space. Do you see crypto as a hot topic for other states, or what's generally?
No, it's a fascinating area, right? And this is something that was very much embraced on the campaign trail particularly from the Trump campaign and now the Trump administration. They've started a kind of crypto task force, and we're seeing really as the candidate that was reaching out to that segment of industry with a great deal. The issue of regulatory oversight of crypto is something that obviously predates the Trump administration and really predates their respective campaigns, with state attorneys general really trying to figure out how crypto falls within their regulatory oversight. And so some states, AG James in New York has really been on the front foot with this. Oregon has stepped into the fray, but I think what you're going to see is more and more, and I don't think this is a partisan issue, to be clear. Okay. I think you're going to see more and more AGs continue to figure out how cryptocurrency fits within the regulatory regime of their given states, whether that is unfair and deceptive trade practices, whether that's securities work. Everyone is kind of figuring out, okay, what is the regulatory paradigm for crypto, and how does that affect us as state attorneys general? And it's one of those things that in the Trump administration, that working group, I think, is going to provide additional levels of clarity on. And so, but make no mistake, when it comes to consumer protection statutes, how these things are marketed, how they are shown to consumers, how they are pitched. These are things that, regardless of whether or not it's going to fit into a different state securities law, that is going to always fit within the bandwidth of state consumer protection enforcement.
Because it potentially harms their residents in the state. So anything that harms their residents. What about antitrust? Federally, there's a healthy bipartisan scrutiny over the tech industry, and on an antitrust side, where do the states fall in a lot of that? I assume they're different depending on, like, California is probably a lot different than others, but
right. It's interesting. When we talked about this in our first pod, kind of as we thought that the Trump administration, at least FTC and DOJ, might take a bit more passive role when it comes to the deal making side on antitrust. I think we're kind of in a wait and see with FTC right now. They've fired both of the Democratic members, and so I think they're still kind of figuring things out. But the FTC has still taken a kind of a populist look at these things, and so I'm not going to be surprised to see them still have some questions to be asked when it comes to the deal making side. But the less public they are about that, or the less on the front foot, I still think you're going to see attorneys general, particularly Democratic attorneys general, step up and ask those questions on the deal making side.
I would assume each state AG has their own set of priorities. I also assume, given our past discussion, that most revolve around protecting the residents of their states. But is there any, we talked about UDAP and antitrust, like, what else is out there? I assume the labor practices and human trafficking, things like that, are all hot.
Sure. And, combating human trafficking is something that states have shown a wonderful ability to work together on, and it is a shared priority across all 50 states and the District of Columbia. They work very closely on this. They have their own working groups, and it's something that transcends partisan divide. Data privacy and data breach work and consumer privacy issues, I think, is another one of those issues where AGs have focused on, and oftentimes they find themselves in multi-states for large data breach issues. Organized retail crime is, not something that necessarily always grabs giant headlines, but that is another working group amongst state attorneys general that has found really bipartisan and strong cooperation. And one of the things that they've seen when pulling at the thread of organized retail crime is that leads into other organized crime generally. And so when they're tracking to see, when someone has stolen large amounts of things from a department store, and they find them, they will also find those drugs or human trafficking and things that are associated when it comes to that organized crime.
Gotcha.
So those are three areas for you that that state AGs continue to focus on really oftentimes as a unit. So human trafficking, data privacy, data breach work, and organized retail crime.
Let's switch to healthcare for a second. What are the priorities around healthcare and whatever state assistance is provided, and fraud related to that? I know that there's a lot on the federal side. There's a lot of activity around Medicare Advantage and things like that, but surely the states get into different Medicaid programs and things like that. So, like, where is the sort of stopping fraud in healthcare?
Sure. Let me give you a couple different areas in healthcare. Yeah. Every state attorney's general office has a Medicaid fraud unit, and this tends to be one of the largest staff units in every AG office. It has been a priority for decades and will be a priority for decades going into the future. And again, something that doesn't know a partisan divide, regardless of the state, regardless of the politics. Stopping the waste, fraud, and abuse in the healthcare space has been and will continue to be a priority for offices going throughout. One of the areas that people keep looking at in healthcare is access and affordability. Mm-hmm. And so that gets into the issue we were talking about before, where it comes into mergers. And so what you've seen in some states is an increased focus on consolidation of healthcare companies. And so when you look at mergers of different hospital systems, AGs have been sensitive to look at those issues to say, how is this affecting accessibility to the residents of our state? How is it going to ultimately affect affordability to residents of our state? And it's going to be a continuing area for AGs to focus on now and into the future.
In what particular industries and what do GCs need to be aware of? Maybe the top 3 concerns for either the top 3 states, for state AG cases, or the top 3, industries across all AGs. What advice or what concerns should the GC be looking at if they operate in that state or headquartered in that state?
I want to take a step back because
I know that's kind of a really broad question.
Because it's not only just the state that you're headquartered in, right? It's every state that you're doing business in.
Yeah.
And so it's natural to think that the state we're headquartered in, we're going to face the most threat of regulatory oversight. But what we see from state attorneys general more and more isn't deference to where the state is incorporated. It's, are you affecting the citizenry, the residents of our particular state?
Okay.
And so, my advice to a GC first and foremost is to look at this, holistically, which is not just where you were based, but what states are you doing business in,
and what people are you impacting?
Right. And so, if you're working in 20 states, then you need a 20 state view of this, not I'm headquartered in California, so I need to just focus on California. That's not the way state AGs look at this.
Yep.
If you're headquartered in California, but you're doing work in Wyoming, you need to think about Wyoming as much as you do about California. Communication and education are key. And so state AG offices are, not surprisingly, like any regulator, oftentimes spread fairly thin. And so your ability to go in when you have a new business model or you have a new widget, and to go in and talk to senior staff, really make them understand what you're doing. And this is going to be continually vital when you have a disruptive business model or new technology, or bringing new technology to a tried and true industry.
Okay.
Right. So, taking your healthcare situation, the more technological advances we have, the more that's going to change what we know to be, the bread and butter of a particular industry. So financial services keeps changing with more technological advancements. Healthcare keeps changing with more technological advancements. And so don't wait for them to come in and start asking questions. Be on that front foot.
Mm-hmm.
And, I think that this is advice that most state attorneys general will be very upfront in saying themselves. We're in a better position when there's communication going both ways. And so being able to have that plan and that understanding of two-way communication with these offices, which they are 99 times out of 100 very happy to have on the front end.
Okay. And so, do GCs just make the rounds to all the different state AGs if they're in a business that impacts residents, whether they operate in that state or whether they have a product that, people buy or whatever? Are they just making the rounds to all the different states that
every company's going to handle that a little bit differently?
Yeah.
Candidly, it's not practical for a GC to. That if they did that would be all of their time.
Which is why I asked, how do they manage that? Do they have like a government affairs people for each state, or?
So, some do that through government affairs work. Usually, it's handled on a legal side because we're talking about compliance with legal issues.
Yeah.
So, oftentimes I work with companies on these to come up with what that engagement strategy looks like, to talk about how we go in, how we identify the right staff in these offices to have the right conversation at the right time, both within the cadence of the priorities of the company and the office.
Let's circle back to California for just a second. So their environmental reporting bills that came out not too long ago require companies who operate in that state to be able to report in to, certain environmental things. Do you have a sense for how companies are addressing this?
I haven't been tracking the environmental reporting in California.
SB, I can't remember what the bills are. It's like two different bills that came out not too long ago.
But environmental enforcement is kind of one of the under-heralded powers of state attorneys general offices. And it's something that, juxtaposing that what we were talking about earlier when it comes to CFPB or FTC, if we see EPA take a step back, which won't surprise anybody, I think you can see the environmental enforcement side of AG offices around the country kind of look at that in the same way that they're looking at those traditionally consumer protection related powers.
Does it separate sort of along, party lines as well? And I'm not trying to say that they're all political beasts and Democratic states are, really driving this differently. But for like environmental stuff, I'm sure Texas is a little bit different than California.
They're all a little bit different. I don't necessarily think that falls on party lines. Okay. I think you've seen some traditional red states have robust environmental enforcement efforts as well. I think it's politically different on how it's publicized, less so on how it's enforced.
Tell me, just wrapping up a little bit, I'd like to hear just a little bit about your practice at Foley.
Sure.
And your partners and the types of things you guys are staying busy with.
No, thanks so much for the question. At Foley Lardner, proud to say we have the most chambers rated attorneys in the state attorney general specialty. Our practice focuses on a wide range of client and industry, and focuses really in kind of, three buckets. And it's a similar three buckets that we chatted about last time. Proactive engagement, compliance, and investigations. That sort of proactive engagement section is what I was kind of alluding to when you talked about best practices for GCs. I'm going to broaden that a little bit, not to say just GCs, but say legal departments in general. And so we work with clients in highly regulated industries and with disruptive business models to really help kind of educate and level set among state AGs as to where these new technologies, where these new widgets, where these new business models fit within their regulatory paradigm. The second bucket there is creating custom compliance plans. We're rolling out this new practice. Can you help us see how this fits within what new regulatory structures that we're going to need in the states within which we do business? And the third, tried and true area of state attorney's general practice is actively representing clients through the investigations that come in. And it is a very unique area dealing with the investigations with state attorneys general. Unlike civil litigation where you have your rules of practice, both at state and federally, those aren't really something that exists when it comes to an investigation. When you get a civil investigative demand from a state attorney's general office, and it's general own expertise that's happened just through being part of that practice for so long, and understanding that not every state deals with it the same way, not everyone's on the same timeline, and being able to bring that expertise to bear on the benefit for the client.
Yeah, I know the regulations for disclosures around data breach are different, for every state.
Oh, yeah. So. I mean, it's a mosaic.
Yeah.
And so understanding and already having that information at your fingertips as to, some states have like a reasonability requirement. You let us know within a reasonable amount of time. Some say 48 hours and everything in between.
Right.
And so really, but knowing who the staff are, particularly in a given office that deal with data breach work, or you can have that open communication with, is really vital when you're dealing with kind of the crisis management that happens in those given moments.
Do you feel like corporate legal departments of public companies, Fortune 500, Fortune 1000, whatever, do you think that they really have a handle in-house on all the states that they're impacting or have some touch with, and some requirements and all the regulations for each of those states? I mean, it's hard enough keeping up with the federal stuff, but like how do legal departments normally manage that? Do they have just a huge matrix or database of all these things, and then they have to get data feeds to keep them updated and refreshed and all that? I know a little bit about this from the cyber and data breach side of things, but tell me generally, like how do they...
Well, I'll give you the ultimately lawyerly answer, which is to say it depends. And so depending on the size and breadth and organization of your in-house network and your outside counsel network is largely going to dictate how sophisticated and how efficient you are in monitoring all of those issues.
Yeah.
Some do a phenomenal job. Some have room for improvement. One of the things is to make sure that you are doing as much as possible to make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks. And that involves not just having appropriate in-house structure that monitors those issues, but a good outside counsel structure as well.
Yeah.
And so I think, companies that have recognized that states are really on the front foot when it comes to passing new regulatory laws, and state AGs are really at the tip of the spear when it comes to regulatory enforcement, and have come up with custom compliance plans to recognize that, have put themselves in the best position for success while lowering regulatory risk of enforcement from state AGs.
Let's talk more about like companies that are sort of high growth, mid-market. I mean, there's a lot of tech companies out there that are growing very fast. Maybe they want to get to IPO at some time, but they're growing and they are starting to, see the issues that bigger companies are having, but they don't have the resources internally to deal with this, nor do they have the foundation to understand.
They're trying to grow as fast as possible.
Yeah.
And really trying to put on blinders and hope that they don't get tripped up by regulatory enforcement issues.
I mean, that seems dangerous and risky, and it seems like they should be getting some advice maybe as they're doing that. Because I feel that just from my, consulting hat, that I put on too, is that there has been just tremendous growth out there in a lot of companies, particularly in the tech sector, but also, tech in healthcare and things like that. And there's a lot of states.
Yeah. There's a couple things companies can do that I think have really proven helpful and successful. One, put in a system that deals with consumer complaints if you have a consumer-facing business. And so whether those are coming directly to you or whether that's going through an AG office, every single AG office has a mechanism where residents complain. The AG offices take the complaint, they flip it over to the company and say, please respond within X amount of time and let us know how you're dealing with this. This is low-hanging fruit. Create a process that addresses consumer problems, because what you don't want is that one complaint in an AG office turned into 10 complaints, and what was going to be an easy fix by being responsive is now turned to a CID.
Yeah.
That first and foremost, kind of create that structure. The other thing is continuing to work with sometimes in-house, sometimes outside counsel, as you're bringing your new business model to market, as figuring out where those bright lines are, or those kind of rules of the road, and where those regulatory pressure points are. A lot of times companies are going to want to, take the risk and keep going, and sometimes they're going to want to alter or change the business model or the widget or whatever that is. But identifying those things earlier are going to help you be prepared across the long haul.
Yeah.
And then 3, taking those regulatory issues seriously when they do come up. You can't treat an investigation from a state attorney general the same way that you will from FTC or CFPB. It's not the same.
Right.
And so you get great benefit by recognizing that and treating it accordingly.
So now is the time where I'll ask you to pull out your crystal ball and tell me what you see for the next 6 months, year, 2 years down the road.
So we started to allude to this really at the beginning of the conversation, which was the role the state AGs are going to play as the federal regulators take a step back. We've seen the first steps come in as with regards to the CFPB and taking over some of those cases, but I think you're going to see a much larger impact for state AGs in 2 particular areas, financial services and tech generally.
Okay.
And so the less the federal government does, and I think this is going to be largely bipartisan, those are going to be 2 areas that are going to see state AGs be on the front foot, be the tip of the spear, and continue to fill that regulatory gap.
Okay. So UDAP and tech, and you mentioned healthcare earlier too, access and affordability. But yeah, I mean, UDAP is big. What would you say? What are the top 3 states that are really aggressive about UDAP on their residents?
Well, New York just actually recently passed laws expanding their consumer protection powers and authorities. Mm-hmm. So looking out for New York, Massachusetts, California, Illinois, and don't discount just because they have a more conservative bent, but Florida and Texas.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I know, from past experience, I know Georgia has also been pretty active when it comes to UDAP, and This goes back a decade, probably.
Sure.
Yeah. Great. Well, really appreciate you coming on the podcast, and you are our first law firm partner on this podcast.
I'm honored.
I know we've talked before, but great stuff, really timely, and always great to see you as well. So thank you so much for coming on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
All right.